response this time is not going to be symbolic. This time, I would anticipate that the Israeli response will be much more robust.
Hi, Avi. Thank you so much for joining the call. Very much appreciate it. I was just wondering, if you could tell me a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Yes, my name is Avi Melamed. I'm a former Israeli intelligence official and senior official on Arab affairs. I am the founder of Inside the Middle East Institute, providing apolitical, non-partisan education about the Middle East.
Just talking about the Iranian strikes, can you just talk to me about, what you thought when that happened? Were you surprised? What do you think about those strikes?
Look, we have to look at it in the wide context of what has been going on in the region in the last year, but even before the last year, for the last couple of decades. To make a long story short, the Iranian regime is trying to position itself as the superpower in the Middle East, and to that extent, it has created a network of armies of terror called the Axis of Resistance. That includes organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others. In the last year, following Hamas' attack on Israel on October 7, Israel fight back and damage seriously those proxies of the Iranians. For the Iranian regime, this is a bad news. And particularly in the Middle East, and particularly in the last couple of weeks when Israel was smashing Hezbollah, the most significant proxy of the Iranians, to the point the Arab world started to mock Iran and its proxies. For the Iranian regime, and like any other player in the Middle East, sometimes the image of deterrence is not less significant than deterrence itself. So at this point, the Iranian regime finds itself in a place where it basically felt that it has to launch this attack in order to try to restore its declining deterrence image. And because for the Iranian regime, if it's going to be viewed as weak, as it's being viewed across the Middle East today, this is something that could endanger the endurance of that regime. Hence their decision to attack.
And also, how will Iran be feeling with, Israel deciding to invade Lebanon in order to, attack Hezbollah?
Already by now, the Iranians are very embarrassed because what happened to Hezbollah, the elimination of the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and all the military commanders of Hezbollah, the sophisticated attack on the beepers, and endlessly attacks of Israel that basically charged Hezbollah heavy prices. For the Iranians, in the discussion in the Middle East, many people in the Middle East are basically saying that Iran has thrown under the bus its proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah. For the Iranian, again, in order to try and to keep a face in the region and to restore the declining image and deterrence, they need to act to basically try to restore. But the issue is that, ironically speaking, it may result in the counter-productive outcome.
And in what way?
Because it's very likely that Israel is going to respond to the Iranian attack, and the response this time is not going to be symbolic as the previous time following the Iranian attack on April 13 on Israel. Following that attack, Israel kind of like responded in a very symbolic way. This time, I would anticipate that the Israeli response will be much more robust and much more visible. And for the Iranian regime, the scenario that it's very likely to happen, where the whole Middle East will see one day, sometime, the damage that Israel has been inflicting in Iran. When you see that in the Middle East, that has an enormous ripple effect. And so in that sense, I mean, if the Iranian regime is going to be severely attacked by Israel, and it's going to lose strategic assets, and it's going to be very visible and very visual, the meaning of that is that the Iranian regime launched an attack on Israel, hoping to restore its declining deterrence image, but actually what happens in the end is that it's kind of like come across as very vulnerable and very weak.
Yeah. And you mentioned there that, how Israel will respond. It won't be a symbolic attack and it'll be a robust attack. Analysts have been talking today about how Israel might strike, Iran's oil fields, that kind of thing. But also I've been speaking to other experts yesterday about how Israel could potentially launch attacks on Iran's nuclear sites, before they actually create enough uranium and weaponry to actually, make a nuclear bomb. So when you say that Israel could respond, could they could they attack the nuclear sites?
Well, look, I assume that from a military perspective, such capacities exist. Again, but I don't necessarily think that that will be the target. I think that the Israeli response clearly is going to be coordinated with the United States. And I think that the United States totally understand the need to respond fiercely. However, the United States, I would say, would not like to see an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities or Iran's oil facilities. So I don't think that that will be the target of the upcoming Israeli attack.
Right, okay. And I mean, what would they be striking then if Israel does launch an attack on Iran? What will they be focusing on?
Well, first, you could clearly expect that differently from the Iranian attack that is totally indiscriminately targeting cities and civilians, you could definitely be sure that the Israeli attack will be very much pinpoint. And it will focus on very clear, legitimate targets, such, for example, military bases, infrastructure that is vital for the Iranian military establishment. I would expect, I would not exclude also attacking some governmental symbols of the Mullah regime, and particularly the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard in Iran. So there is no lack of targets, I would say, that Israel could hit, causing the Mullah regime substantial damage, yet not to the point where the Mullah regime necessarily will have to counter-react. Because here there is a fine line, of delicate line, where it's clear to the United States and also to Israel and the region that an Israeli response is inevitable. It should take place. The question is, what kind of a response would it be that on the one hand will send a shocking message to the Iranian regime, that will send a shocking message across the region, but yet at the same time will not inevitably, will not lead in an inevitable way to further escalation of the tensions.
And that must be a very difficult, game to play in terms of not going too far, but going far enough. And you mentioned there that they might strike the military, infrastructure. Can you just expand what you mean by military infrastructure for our readers?
Well, it could be missiles base, it could be bases of IRGC, it could be drone factories, it could be anything that has to do with military activities.
Yeah.
I would expect that some of those things will be likely part of the target's attack.
And just talking kind of more generally about Iran and their nuclear capabilities in terms of they are, forming uranium, they want to make a nuclear bomb, but right now they don't have the right infrastructure. But what would happen if Iran, if Israel got intelligence that Iran was about to make an Iranian nuclear weapon? Would it be then that they, could strike nuclear bases? I'm not talking about this week, but in the future, if they feel that threatened.
Look, I mean, Israel constantly said that it will not enable Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Obviously, now that you see that we are dealing with a brutal, dangerous regime that is attacking countries with hundreds of ballistic missiles, you can further understand why Israel has such a good reason not to allow Iran to have a nuclear military capacity. But it's not only Israel, it's the world.
Mm.
And this is the most significant thing. This is a very pivotal moment. This is a moment of truth, you know. For too long, Western powers chose not to confront this regime. Kind of like kicking the can down the road, thinking that some strange mindset that, you know, well, it's not really our problem and, you know, it will solve by itself or whatever. But what we saw constantly all those years, many years, of the Iranian aggression, that the situation only became worse and worse.
Mm.
And it goes back to a very simple lesson that, you know, every person that still has functioning mind knows if you don't deal with the bully when it's little, you will have to deal with the bully when it's big.
If Israel does retaliate in a strong response, as you said, what would happen then? What is the worst case scenario? Could there be a war between global powers eventually? Is that, you know, one of your fears? Could that happen?
Well, look, it's definitely a possible scenario, but not necessarily inevitable one. But again, I mean, we are witnessing a situation where it has the potential to further escalate. And I wouldn't go into the place of, you know, some people are talking about it as a global war, WW3. I wouldn't necessarily go there. But I would definitely say that assuming there is going to be an Israeli significant strike response, then the ball will be at the court of the Iranian regime. And following that, the Iranian regime decision how to react to assumingly upcoming Israeli response would, to a large extent, dictate the trajectory down the road, and particularly in the context of the United States role.
Mm.
Because if we will find ourselves in a scenario of a wide open war between Israel and Iran, the United States will have to step in. And so that will be a situation where the calculations have to be meticulously done by all the sides involved, and particularly by the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime is very vulnerable in many ways. And Israel, let alone the United States, could simply hit that regime to the point it will collapse. If there will be, and I don't think that will be the case in the upcoming Israeli response, but if there will be an attack on the Iranian regime oil infrastructure and some other strategic infrastructure, that would definitely could result in a generated process, a rapid process that will lead to the downfall of this regime.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there that, you know, Iran is vulnerable. How is Iran vulnerable? Just expand on that point, if you could.
Iran is vulnerable for different aspects. First, it is totally dependent upon its oil revenues. Second, Iran is a semi-arid country. It has a very significant challenge of water, which causes constantly unrest across Iran. Iran is huge in its territory. Also, there is many dysfunctioning or partially functioning national level systems or infrastructure. Yeah, like electricity supply, water supply, and stuff like that. So in many different aspects, the regime has many Achilles heels, so to speak, you know, soft targets. But also, in addition to that, we have to remember that there is a constant unrest in Iran because majority of the Iranians clearly would love to see this regime goes down. And this is a brutal regime that is oppressing the Iranian people. There are minorities in Iran that are badly oppressed by the Mullah regime, the Baluchis, the people in Khuzestan. So there are many points of weakness that the Mullah regime is aware of. And hence the understanding that if severely damaged, the accumulative impact of something like that could be potentially the downfall of the Mullah regime.
Do you feel like the West and the US especially have done enough to thwart Iran, to stop them, to kind of stem their power? Because obviously Iran have got so many of these proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, so many proxies that, is in their pay pocket. Do you think that the US and West have done enough?
Well, I mean, when you see the reality on the ground, and particularly what's happening right now in the Middle East, the answer is very clear. The answer is no. Big time.
Yeah. And how does that make you feel?
Look, as a professional analyst, and I have been for years warning about that. In fact, in my most recent book, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era, that was published in 2022, I specifically portrayed that scenario that we see today. And I was very clearly indicating that the road leads there. It is very unfortunate and very frustrating to see that policymakers in the West, for whatever the reason, chosen not to confront this enormously alarming reality. And there are different reasons for that. The bottom line, but in the end of the day, is going back to the whole issue of the lessons that we should take from the situation. And the lesson here is, again, it's a lesson that we kind of like a little bit the West has forgotten. A pissing, brutal regime doesn't end well. And there is a time where you need to stand and confront such a regime, because if you fail to do that, the price involved is going to be much higher, including for you, meaning the person or the factor that wants to restrain that brutal regime. But it's very clear that there has been unwillingness of Western power to seriously confront them.
And when you say confront the regime, what actually needs to be done? What needs to be done to bring down Tehran?
There should be a very tight sanctions with no alleviation or any concession of any sort. Tightening sanctions, suffocating sanctions, non-compromising diplomatic boycott all across the board in every possible aspect. In other words, using relentlessly every possible non-military handle of pressure. And making clear to the Iranian regime that the military option is real. And if the Iranian regime wants to survive somehow, it has to comply with what the world is saying to it, and what's the interests of the international community. But the Western policymakers clearly failed to do that.
And with the invasion of Lebanon, that decision by Israel, what is their endgame now? What are they, what are Israel wanting to do now? What's their endgame?
The endgame is to enable Israeli citizens who live in North Israel to be able to go back to their homes and live their life like normal people. There is international United Nations Security Council resolutions 1557 and 1701 that clearly ordered the Lebanese government to deploy the Lebanese army along the border and to make sure that the Hezbollah will remain north of the Litani River. The Lebanese government, which is kind of like a ridiculous entity, because Lebanon is a facade. Lebanon, the real boss in Lebanon is Iran and Hezbollah, or hopefully one day has been. But for now, they kind of like control all the Lebanese government agencies and decision-making position and centers of power. And so the bottom line is that because of the failure of the state called Lebanon, because of the takeover of Lebanon by Iran and the Hezbollah, Israel has the one that has to pay the price for that. This is unacceptable and inconceivable. There is no reason why Israeli citizens should pay for the incompetence and corruption of the inner political system in Lebanon. And if that system cannot make sure that its neighbor from the south, namely Israel, will have the right to live calmly and peacefully, then Israel has to act in order to make it happen. So the end goal here is very clear. To create conditions that will enable Israeli civilians. There are some 60 or 70,000 Israeli citizens that became refugees because of the Hezbollah's attack on Israel. And to enable those people to go back to their homes, to their communities, to restore their lives, and so on. And the only way to do that, since, as I said before, no one is imposing resolutions of the Security Council, Israel has no other choice but to do it itself. And it has to be done militarily because there is no other way.
How will Hezbollah be feeling, since the invasion of Lebanon?
Look, the Hezbollah now in a very dire situation. It has been severely beaten. For many years, the Hezbollah basically built itself not only as a Lebanese superpower, but as a regional superpower. The Hezbollah is involved in other arenas, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. It became the cornerstone of the Iranian regime imperialistic vision. And so in the Arab world, which to a large extent loathe Hezbollah, because the involvement of Hezbollah in the war in Syria, because the fact that the Hezbollah kidnapped Lebanon, because the fact that the Hezbollah dragged Lebanon and its people time after time to destruction and death and havoc. In the Arab world, Hezbollah is very much loathed. And so, but was very much also, they were afraid of Hezbollah because Hezbollah was really able to position itself as a regional power. So it's no wonder that when Israel smashed so hard the Hezbollah in such short period of time by taking out all of its leadership, the famous story of the Beeper attacks, the hundreds of field commanders of Hezbollah that basically were hunted one after the other by Israel very precisely. In the Arab world, they are celebrating the defeat of the Hezbollah. And not less significant is that in Lebanon, most of the Lebanese resent Hezbollah, loathe Hezbollah. And the Lebanese urged Hezbollah during all this year, do not drag us to this war. This is not our war. Hezbollah, of course, ignored the Lebanese because Hezbollah got used to do whatever Hezbollah in Iran wants to do in Lebanon. All the rest doesn't concern them. So now, when everybody see Hezbollah lying on the floor, severely damaged, in the Arab world, they're talking about it in almost in terms like they kind of like compare the damage that Israel caused to Hezbollah. They compare it that something that is almost equal as to the Israeli triumph in the war in 1967. And so in Lebanon, obviously, as you could imagine, now there is a very strong backwind for the Lebanese who actually says all those years, we want our country back. We want to restore our Lebanon. We want to restore sovereignty. Our sovereignty was stolen from us, kidnapped, hijacked by the Hezbollah. So definitely right now, as we are talking, I can see very clearly this picking up, this momentum. Obviously, you know, Hezbollah cannot go back to the October 6th reality of Lebanon, where he was the big boss and that's it. Things have changed. And so one of the interesting things to see will be, of course, how the Hezbollah is going to interact with the inner Lebanese system under the new circumstances following his agonizing defeat. This is one of the major things to follow, because this thing has also a major ripples effect when you look at other arenas like Syria that borders Lebanon, also the Iraqi arenas. Because in those arenas, as you may recall, there are locals who actually are very resentful and, you know, rejecting the Iranian interference or the Iranian rule. For example, in Syria right now, and it's not a coincidence. One of the things that I've noticed is that now there is some sort of like momentum of the Syrian rebels that are saying, now that the Hezbollah has been defeated, now it's our time to resume in a large volume the war against the Iranian proxies in Syria and against Assad regime. Assad himself, interesting enough, is totally silent vis-a-vis what happened to Hezbollah, even though the Hezbollah was one of the major factors that actually, in the end of the day, saved Assad rule during the war.
And that's really interesting what you just said, how with Hezbollah on the back foot now, where Israel have kind of, you know, gone in with this strong hand, and that actually could mean that, you know, the proxies are turning against Iran itself. So that could this be, you know, the beginning of a new age almost of you know, these proxies turning against Iran?
Well, no, it's not that the proxies are turning against Iran, but basically what it does, it's that it's because of the fact that two major proxies of Iran, Hezbollah and Hamas, are so severely beaten, and particularly the defeat of Hezbollah. The outcome of that is that it gives a momentum and a backwind to existing voices and factors in the arenas that are controlled by Iran, namely Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. These are factors that are basically constantly reject the Iranian intervention. And so now with the weakening of the axis of resistance following the major blow that Israel caused Hezbollah and Hamas, and the declining image of the Iranian deterrence, which further probably will be further declining following an expected Israeli upcoming attack, that will give a backwind to all those factors in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, that are basically opposing the Iranian intervention. They want to kick them out or to limit their intervention. So it will be very interesting to see how that will be translated on the ground.
So what would be the repercussions of that?
If in the Lebanese system we are going to see a new picture where the Hezbollah is not any longer the one that makes the call, where the Lebanese really have the ability to control their life, to decide when do they want to go to war and who do they want to do peace with, obviously this is a very dramatic change. Syria, if the rebels are going to resume massive attack against the Iranian-backed proxies, and if Assad will decide that maybe this is the time to start detaching himself more and more from the Iranian hug, a process that, by the way, already exists, and turn to the Arab world, who basically rehabilitated Assad, but up until now did not translate this rehabilitation into financial investment as Assad was hoping, because the Arab world is still waiting for Assad to detach itself from the Iranians. That could be another significant development. In other words, if all those things are going to happen and are going to result in an increasing pressure on the Iranians and their proxies, the meaning of that is that the diminishing ability of the Iranians and the proxies to continue to dictate the radical agenda as they have been able to do for the last couple of decades. The more that capacity diminished, the better, because it means more stability to the region. That is the potential ramifications, the repercussions of the cracking of the and weakening of the axis of resistance and the Iranian regime. Some people already in the Arab world, too soon, very too soon, to my opinion, are rushing in and talking about the collapse and disintegration of axis of resistance. That is a very exaggerating evaluation. The axis of resistance is here, and it's still here, and the Iranians are still here. But the issue here is, in the end of the day, to create a new balance where that negative, destructive factor does not have the ability any longer to be the only player on the field.
And my final question, I promise. What is your biggest fear now?
Iran and Hezbollah can cause Israel a significant damage in terms of destruction and death and so on. When you are shooting hundreds and hundreds of missiles, ballistic missiles on cities, up until now, Israel and the US-led coalition were successfully intercepting those missiles, but the outcome could have been, or could be, much more severe in terms of life loss. But, you know, sometimes you just have to do the right thing.